This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. With states and cities now debating raising the minimum wage, economist John Schmitt says the issue is more about inequality than about jobs. Professor Jonathan Zimmerman explains why he wants to repeal the 22nd Amendment and let presidents serve as many terms as the voters want them to. And Bill Press talks with Ginger Gibson, Politico's budget expert. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. All of a sudden, lawmakers in cities and states are talking about raising the minimum wage locally. Economist John Schmitt says it's a popular idea but won't happen at the federal level as long as Republicans hold the House of Representatives. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, John Schmitt is a senior economist with the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. He's written extensively on economic inequality, unemployment, labor market institutions, and other topics for both academic and popular audiences. John Schmitt, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you.
Now, you have written recently about the minimum wage. How much should it be raised? And practically speaking, how much can it be raised in this political environment?
Well, I think, as you say, there's sort of two dimensions there. There's an economic question as to how high we can go, and I would add to that how fast we can go. And then there's a second dimension, which is what is realistic in terms of politics. In terms of the economy, it's really hard to fathom exactly how much the minimum wage has fallen in terms of its value relative to its peak in the 1960s. No matter which way you look at the numbers, the minimum wage is way below what it was in 1968. And if you consider that we're twice as rich per person now as we were in 1968, it's pretty astonishing. It means that low-wage workers have basically not participated at all in any of the economic growth that we've had for almost 50 years. But the benchmark right now, we have a $7.25 federal minimum wage. Many states are a little bit above that, but not a lot above that. And if we had just kept pace with inflation from the time 1968 at the peak to the present, the minimum wage would be on the order of about $10 per hour. If we kept it at the same relative level, the same minimum wage relative to what the average worker makes, we would be at something between $10 and $12 an hour, depending on exactly what measure you use to determine average wages. And if we had kept pace with productivity growth, which is what the economy had experienced from the end of World War II to 1968, the minimum wage kept pace with the average productivity growth of the worker in the U.S. economy, we would be somewhere around $16 or $17 per hour right now. So we are well below by any measure. The question is whether the politics would support an increase. And I think at this point, because of the makeup of Congress, it's going to be very, very difficult. But given the very high support that the minimum wage has in polls, there was a poll just last week showing that 80% of Americans favor increasing the minimum wage to $9 or $10 an hour. I think that it ought to be something that's possible. It's just difficult in the current context.
Now, how should progressives answer the argument that raising the wage will cost jobs, especially for younger people just entering the workforce?
Well, we have a vast amount of evidence of minimum wage increase. We have enormous experience. It's not some sort of theoretical thing where we look at a textbook explanation of what happens when the minimum wage goes up and make predictions about what the response in terms of employment is going to be. We have a lot of experience with minimum wage increases. The minimum wage started in the 1930s in the recession, and we've increased it many, many times over the last 60, 70 years. And what we consistently find is that the kinds of increases that we have in the United States, phased in, relatively modest increases, have no impact on employment of workers. And there's a whole lot of reasons why that might be true. I think one of the most important ones is that when you raise the minimum wage, you reduce turnover at the workplace. So firms find it easier to retain recruit and retain workers. It actually saves them money. It might not completely compensate for the increase, but it offsets a lot of it. Another issue is that we know economic inequality has increased a lot over the last 30 years. And one reason is that the bottom has fallen out of the labor market because the minimum wage has fallen so much after you adjust for inflation. And increasing the minimum wage, I think, has a much bigger impact on reducing inequality than it does on any kind of employment outcomes. It's a big topic, and it's a big issue as to try how best to answer that particular argument. But I think that the key issue from just a policy point of view is that we have a lot of experience with increasing the minimum wage, and we know consistently that it has no impact when we do it at moderate levels of increases and we phase them in, which is exactly what all the proposals that I'm aware of are proposing right now.
A very simplified answer that I hear to that same sort of question is you put more money in the pockets of people, they're going to go out and spend that money because they can, and everything grows because of it, and then businesses grow and they can hire more people. And so it's sort of, that's a very simplified, if you ever want to use that answer, feel free. But
no, I think that's an important point. I think the minimum wage is part of, it's not this total solution to, but it's part of a program that would shift the driver of economic growth away from, this kind of trickle down, what's good for rich people approach that we've been following for 3 decades to, what is going to benefit workers at the middle and the bottom, who are the people who go out and basically spend the money that creates the economic prosperity that we have in the economy. I would just say the minimum wage, I think, is only a part of that. I think there's a lot of other things that we need to do as well, but it's a central, easy, and important part.
Yeah. We're speaking with John Schmitt, senior economist with the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. John, the statistics on wages and productivity are shocking, to say the least. In the last 30 or so years, the average American worker is increasing productivity but falling way behind in wages, relatively speaking. How did it happen?
Well, I think that the standard argument that you'll hear from many economists is that workers just haven't maintained the level of skills that they need to survive in the new economy. And I actually don't believe that. We've had a massive increase in educational attainment in the United States, but I think it goes deeper than that. I think the real issue is that over the last 3 decades, we have systematically reduced the bargaining power of workers at the middle and the bottom. We have made very specific decisions in policy that make it harder for workers to bargain with their employers in a reasonable way. And I'm not just talking about in a union context, although we've had a huge decline in unionization. We used to have, in the 1970s, close to 1 in 4 workers in the private sector were unionized, and now it's about 6 or 7%, for example. But we've also pulled the bottom out because we no longer have a minimum wage that keeps pace with even inflation, let alone with productivity. But we've also privatized and deregulated a lot of industries that used to provide good jobs, and now workers in those industries like trucking or interstate busing or telecommunications. At the airlines, they've been deregulated, and it's much harder for those jobs to maintain the standards in terms of pay and benefits that they used to have. We've also followed a path of globalization that responds much more to corporate interests than to workers' interests, and that has made it much easier for employers to threaten that we're going to move overseas if there's wage increases, for example. That's all happened in a context where we've kept the unemployment rate at a much too high level, and that undermines bargaining power of workers. When workers know that there are 2 or 3 or 50 people standing behind them that wanting to have their job, they're much less able to bargain with their employers for improvements in pay and benefits. Whereas if the unemployment rate is low, employers are looking hard for workers, and they have to make compromises in order to get new workers on. They have to pay more and provide better benefits. So I think for me, it's about bargaining power. It's about specific policies that we followed. It's not about technology or the failure of workers to keep up.
Is this more of a political football than it is an economic issue at this point?
You mean the minimum wage in general?
Yeah.
I think it's an odd political football because, as I was saying, recent polls show extremely high levels of support for increasing the minimum wage, and not just among, say, Democrats or independents, but even a majority of Republicans are in favor of increasing the minimum wage, I think because, it rewards work. It's a non-governmental program in some sense that rewards work. And so I think there's a lot of support. I think what happens is, when it comes to Congress, there are some fairly well-organized opponents of the minimum wage, the National Restaurant Association being one of the leading examples, that really push very, very hard. And that, I think, is where the problem lies. It's not with the popular politics. I think, as I said, most people are strong supporters of the minimum wage. It has to do with the way it plays out in the Congress.
Gosh, so a couple of strong lobbying arms, and it doesn't matter what the populace says, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that that has a big impact. I mean, it is totally possible to overcome this, and we've had experiences in the past when there's been bipartisan passage of minimum wage increases, where Republican presidents, I think, feeling political pressure, have signed bills or haven't blocked bills to increase the minimum wage. So it is possible to break through, but it's hard, especially in a climate where the unemployment rate is still high.
We're always thinking of the minimum wage as a floor, a safety net for the lowest portion of the income scale, but you argue a higher minimum wage is crucial for building the middle class as well. How does that work?
Well, I mean, it is very important, and I think the issue is you have a floor, which is what you build the rest of the economy on top of. So there's obviously a direct impact of the minimum wage on low-wage workers, but where middle-wage workers slot into the economy is always relative to where people on the bottom are. And I think if you raise people at the bottom, you might not have as big a direct impact on people in the middle, but it creates a relative benchmark. So, for example, if you think about what happens right now, we have a federal minimum wage of $7.25. If it went up to $9 per hour, there would be workers who were making $9 an hour right before the increase relative to, say, new entrants that were making $7.25. Well, those workers, once everybody's at $9 an hour, will need some extra pay differential to differentiate them from the new hires. And their employers, we have evidence, and there's a lot of reason to believe that they'll raise their wage to $9.50 or $10 to maintain at least some of the differential that was there before. So there's a kind of a trickle-up effect that I think is real important and has a long-term implication for the middle of the wage distribution. As we were saying earlier, if you have a minimum wage that had kept track with productivity, it might be $16 or $17 per hour today. That's basically the median wage. That's the wage that the middle wage worker in the United States makes. We would live in a very, very different world if the absolute floor was equivalent to what is basically what a middle wage worker makes. Almost all of the benefits of economic growth, not all of them, but almost all of them for the last 30 years have gone to workers at the very top. And there's a lot that we can do to rearrange the economy and make it work more for people at the middle and the bottom, because we're very rich. We're a very rich country.
Sure. You touched on earlier, John, that raising the minimum wage alone isn't necessarily enough to do this, but what else do we need to do to stimulate the economy?
Well, I think, as you were saying, we need to figure out ways to get money into the hands of people in the middle and the bottom, who are the people who are going to go out and spend it. And I think there's plenty of ways to do that in the short and in the long term. If we focus just on the long term, I think we want to make sure that we restore the bargaining power for workers. And the most important ways to do that include increasing the minimum wage, which helps workers at the bottom, reversing the decline in unionization, which is, for the most part, policy-driven. What we've had is a very difficult set of circumstances legally for workers to organize in the private sector. If we turn that around, that would increase bargaining power, particularly for workers in the middle. I think we need to rethink the way we do our trade deals to make sure that they benefit workers as much or more than they benefit the corporations, which is the way we've done things now. Build in safeguards to make sure that they're not used against workers. Those are the kinds of things that we can do in the long term. And in the short term, I think the key is to have a return to the unemployment rate of 5 or even 4%, which is what we had at the end of the 1990s. The only time in the last 30 years when we've done really well in terms of wage growth for workers at the middle and the bottom was that period from 96 to 2000 when the unemployment rate was very low, and it stayed low for a long time, and that gave workers a lot of bargaining power. Their employers had to respond to their requests for higher wages, better benefits, better work schedules. Even the share of workers with health insurance benefits and pensions increased at that period. That's what we need to go to. And remember, that was a very prosperous period. Employers were doing fine, too. It wasn't just workers that were benefiting out of that time. It is possible to do much better than we've done over the last decade or so.
Okay. John Schmitt, senior economist with the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C., joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. John, thank you so much for your time. Look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. New York University Professor Jonathan Zimmerman says it doesn't matter whether the president is Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama. The people should be able to decide to elect the chief executive as many times as they want. And we'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Ah, 'tis the season for family, friends, eggnog, chipmunks singing Christmas carols, and all-out no-mercy blow-'em-all-to-hell war. Not war like in Afghanistan. No, this is the far right's god-awful war on the war on Christmas. In this season of peace on earth, these delusional hucksters are fomenting hatred of whom? Blasphemous liberal Democrat atheist humanists, they shout, those heathens who actually go around saying Happy Holidays rather than Merry Christmas, as Jesus taught us to say. Or was it Constantine the Great in the 4th century who came up with that? Never mind, the rightist point is that diabolical lefties, i.e. Marxists, are out to ban Christmas entirely. No less of a heroic defender of the faith than Sarah Palin has even written a thin book about this devious plot, revealing that Happy Holidays is merely, quote, the tip of the spear in a larger battle to make true religious freedom a thing of America's past. Luckily, note the Merry Christmas Crusaders, such bright lights as Governor Rick Perry of Texas are pushing state laws to bypass the silly U.S. Constitution and allow Christian icons and ceremonies into our schools. A creche in every public space is their cry, a cross on every city hall. To hell with Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, the winter solstice, etc. This is war. This is Jim Hightower saying, no, this is hokum, hoodoo, camel dung. It's also insulting that they would attempt to create a fictional piece of religious discrimination, whine that they are a repressed minority, and equate it with war. First, Jews, Muslims, and others don't get to brand public spaces as their religious property. Second, about 3/4 of Americans are Christians, so drop the martyr pose. And third, war really is hell, with blood, lifelong trauma, and deaths, so stop pretending you're in one.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Professor Jonathan Zimmerman says that the Constitution's 2-term limit weakens the presidency, weakens the voters, and weakens democracy. He wants to repeal it.
And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Jonathan Zimmerman is professor of education and history and director of the History of Education program at New York University. He recently wrote a widely circulated op-ed calling for an end to the two-term limit for presidents. Jonathan Zimmerman, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's good to be here.
Now, why do you think the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, limiting presidential terms, should be repealed?
Well, there are two reasons. I think there is some evidence that the term limit rule or amendment limits what presidents can accomplish in their second term. But the more important reason, from my point of view, is it limits us. It limits the voters. We should be able to select whom we want to be our president, no matter how long they've served.
Now, of course, there's some popular sentiment in much of the country, especially right now when Congress is pretty much at a standstill and has been for quite a few years now. But people are calling for term limits for members of Congress and state legislatures. Why not for the president?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, I should say that I'm opposed to term limits, quad term limits, even for Congress. But I think in some ways the case in Congress is stronger. And one of those reasons that the case for term limits is stronger in Congress is the power of incumbency is greater. That's not the case for the presidency. So if you look at the history, okay, after the 22nd Amendment was passed, 3 of the next 5 presidents who stood for re-election lost. That would be, of course, Ford, Carter, and Bush Sr. I think there's this worry among the population that I picked up on in the response to my piece that if we allow people to run an unlimited number of times, that they'll win an unlimited number of times. But I don't really think there's evidence for that.
Mm-hmm. Since incumbency is historically such a strong advantage for any candidate, is it conceivable that a president could keep accumulating so much power that after 2, 3, or 4 terms, he or she could become a dictator?
No, I think that's a red herring. I mean, it's interesting you use that phrase because, of course, that's precisely what Republicans said about FDR. And let's be clear. I mean, the 22nd Amendment was a Republican initiative. It passed after the Republicans took control of Congress in 1947. It passed in Congress with every single Republican in Congress voting for it. And then when it went to the states to be ratified, it was overwhelmingly supported by Republicans and also by some Democrats. But here's what's really interesting. Despite all this fear of dictatorship, almost as soon as the amendment was ratified, you find many Republicans questioning it. Why? Well, because their guy was in office. Their guy was Dwight Eisenhower, the first term-limited president. And on the eve of his reelection in 1956, which of course now thanks to the 22nd Amendment would be the only time he could be reelected, Eisenhower made a statement in which he said that he thought the 22nd Amendment was a mistake. He said, and I quote, "The United States ought to be able to choose for its president anybody it wants, regardless of the number of terms he served." And I think Eisenhower was right. There's really no evidence that, if we take away the term limit, that people will just be able to serve forever. Yes, there's a power of incumbency, but I think the historical record shows that with respect to presidents, if we don't like the guy, we're going to throw him out.
Well, it's interesting is because you've got all these Congress, and I'll jump back to Congress and look at all of these folks that they've been in for a long time. They keep getting elected. And yet you look at national polls across the board and even some within their own states, and they point to dissatisfaction with that person, and yet the person keeps getting elected. Is that the fault of the voter then?
Well, look, I think they're very different situations. If you're talking about Congress, you have to think about the way that gerrymandering works. The way that districts have been drawn and redrawn to make them safe for one party or another.
Sure.
And you also have to think about the absence of real campaign finance regulation in this country. I mean, it's become even more shredded since the Citizens United decision, and we're really one of the only democracies in the world that doesn't have real serious and effective regulation of big money in our political system. And look, term limits are not the solution to that. Okay, the solution to that lies in, again, much more efficient regulation. And absent that regulation, if we limit the terms, all we'll do is we'll just have big money influence, let's just say, a larger number of elections because there's going to be more turnover. That's all.
Yeah. We're speaking with Jonathan Zimmerman, professor of education and history and director of the History of Education program at New York University, and we're talking about the recently widely circulated op-ed that the professor wrote calling for an end to the two-term limit for presidents. A lot of Democrats think that if Bill Clinton were allowed to run again in 2000, he would easily have won a third term. Do you agree with that? And then also, do you think that President Obama would run again if he were allowed to, and could he win?
Well, look, I'm a historian. I study as best I can figure out what happened, right? And so I don't know the answer to either question. I will tell you with respect to Clinton that he certainly believed he could be reelected, and I'm not saying he was wrong. With respect to Obama, who knows? Look, a lot of people interpreted my piece as a call for him to serve another term, and that's completely unfair and ungrounded in the piece. And I think any fair reading of the piece can possibly yield the conclusion that what I want is another Obama term. I don't. I think he's been a pretty mixed president, and I didn't write the piece because I wanted him to remain. I don't know if he'd want to remain, but I do know that he should be allowed, if he wishes, to try to remain, and the rest of us should be allowed to vote thumbs up or thumbs down. Otherwise, we diminish him and we diminish ourselves.
I will say that when I read the op-ed when it first appeared in the Washington Post, I went back and read it again, knowing that you were going to be a guest on our program, and I happened to read a lot of the comments. Sometimes I find that more entertaining than articles that I read. But in any case, I got the feeling that a lot of folks didn't bother to read the entire article. To your point,
not.
I mean, you did not state that you wanted President Obama another time. You also stated that Ronald Reagan probably should have been allowed to run again.
And if these let's just call them nicely correspondents had bothered to Google me, they would also know that in 2006, when George W. Bush was president, I wrote a piece for the Christian Science Monitor in which I said yes, he should be allowed to stand for re-election. The circumstances were different, but the argument was the same. The Iraq Study Group had just come out with a report that was highly critical of Bush's decisions in Iraq, and Bush's response was, well, I don't agree with the report, and I'm sleeping soundly at night. And the point I made in the piece is, look, if this guy were up for re-election, maybe he wouldn't be sleeping so soundly. Maybe we don't want our president sleeping soundly, if sleeping soundly means ignoring things like the Iraq Study Group and all of the popular dissent about Iraq. But of course, the correspondents, to use a nice word, they're not really interested in that sort of nuance, right? There's a huge amount of cynicism that runs across our polity. It's bipartisan. And the cynicism really boils down to, if you disagree with me, you're either a fraud or an idiot. And those comments actually reflected both cynical assumptions, right? People said, this guy's just a mouthpiece for Obama. He's obviously just a fraud, right? Invoking all of these irrelevant arguments simply to get his guy in office, or he's some kind of moron, and that is the most cynical idea on the landscape right now of our politics. And like I said, it's bipartisan. You can find it in every different corner of the American polity and the American psyche. The assumption, if I don't agree with you, you're either morally or intellectually warped. That's a poisonous idea. You can't have a small d democratic politic on that ground.
Again, we're speaking with Jonathan Zimmerman, professor of education and history, director of the History of Education program at New York University. So if more than 2 terms is such a good idea, why then did George Washington and nearly every other 2-term president until FDR refuse to seek a 3rd term?
Well, look, first of all, I want to clarify something about Washington because there's a huge amount of myth-making on that score. You're right that Washington did step down after 2 terms, but not because he believed in term limits, nor did most of the Founding Fathers, which is why term limits don't appear in the original document. Some of them did. It was a much debated point at the Constitutional Convention, and there were people arguing vehemently on both sides, and some leading members like George Mason arguing very strongly for term limits, but they lost. Okay? There weren't term limits in the document, so when people say the Founding Fathers favored them, that's false. Some of them did, but they were a minority. It's also false to say that George Washington favored them. Very famous letter to Lafayette, He explicitly said, the people should get to vote for the best person. The reason he stepped down, he said he felt the Republic was in good hands, and that it was time for him to join the citizen population, like Cincinnatus going back to his plow. And that did set an informal tradition, not a constitutional one, that I think reflects, as of the reaction of my piece, frankly, some very deeply grounded American anxiety about executive power. Obviously, we had just fought a revolution against a monarch, and so it shouldn't surprise us that the whole question of term limits is debated in what we might say monarchical or dictatorial terms. Oy vey, if we allow that, we'll have a monarchy or dictatorship. I don't think we will, and the reason is the rest of the Constitution. The part that says that there's an electoral college and that, everyone has a right to vote now regardless of race, and anyone over 18 can cast a ballot, and there aren't poll taxes. Like, we've done a lot in our Constitution to guarantee the right to vote. Some people might say in recent years we haven't done enough, and here, of course, I'm talking about the debate over the Voting Rights Act, but I don't want to get into that. The larger point here is that while I understand and appreciate the fear of monarchical power, which goes back to the roots of the Republic, it does seem to me that the rest of the Constitution provides lots and lots of rules and procedures and guarantees and protections against precisely that. We're better than that. We're not going to make a dictator. We may actually elect somebody for a third or fourth term, but only if we like him or her. And most of all, only if he or she has earned our liking.
And interestingly, I would hazard a guess that we would probably see more people go to the polls if we didn't have term limits, because a lot of times it's anger or the way that you feel about an individual that's going to get you out there. And if it means, oh my gosh, I have to have 4 more years of that, I better get to the polls. Or, hey, I'm glad I got 4 more years of that, I'm going to go to the polls. Who knows?
Indeed. And look, that would yield some interesting outcomes. I mean, of all the reactions to my piece, the one that's puzzled me the most is just the automatic assumption that somebody standing for re-election would be re-elected. But I think you're suggesting some very good reasons to question that. Look, the current president's polls are plummeting. His approval rate is plummeting. It's as low as it's ever been. And if he were up for re-election right now, I think all of the indicators are that he'd have a really hard battle on his hands.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. Jonathan Zimmerman is Professor of Education and History and Director of the History of Education program at New York University. John, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks. It was fun.
All right. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Ginger Gibson of Politico.
The Bill Press Show coming to you live from our studio on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. We're just down the street from the United States Capitol building, where Ginger Gibson, among other the whole host of reporters, covers the doings in the House and in the Senate. And is kind enough to join us in studio this morning, back in studio this morning. Hi, Ginger. Nice to see you again.
Good morning. Glad to be here again.
All right, so the big question is, are you related to David?
No.
Gibson,
no.
Right? Who was at top of the hour? So we thought this was the whole Gibson hour? No?
I don't believe so. I don't know, maybe long-lost cousins.
Maybe. Got to find out. Anyhow, Ginger Gibson is with Politico, not with Religion News Services. So yesterday, let's start here. The big vote and the big announcement made. Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut was presiding on the budget.
On this vote, the yeas are 64, the nays are 36.
and the budget carries it. A big bipartisan vote in the House and in the Senate. Now goes down to the White House. Done deal, right?
It is a done deal. There's little doubt that the president will sign this budget deal. Important to remember, it doesn't actually do much. It doesn't appropriate the money, so they still have to come out and do that again before the January 15th deadline when funding runs out. But big symbolic win that they were able to agree on something, pass a piece of legislation, get it through both chambers on these big bipartisan margins, and send it to the White House.
I know we're going to be talking to Senator Sherrod Brown at the top of the next hour. He, among other senators, were very unhappy with the fact that there was no extension of unemployment benefits as part of this budget deal. What's going to happen there?
Well, the House had some members put forth an amendment that would have added it to this budget deal. House Republicans said it hadn't been agreed upon. They did not include it. Senate Dems really had no way. There was a lot of questions about if they could have even done it themselves without the House started it. So they're left to wait for the House when they come back. And Senator Reid has said it's going to be his top priority. I know Nancy Pelosi was very upset that it wasn't included and wants to see it happen very quickly. And like I said, they have to pass a funding bill in the beginning of the year. They have until the 15th, likely to do an omnibus bill to fund all of government through September. And that could be a vehicle, I think, where we see unemployment attached to that because they need a way to get it done. You're not going to get enough Republicans in the House to vote for it unless it's attached to something, very likely. So it could be that those who, I believe it's 1.3 million people who are going to lose their unemployment insurance the week after Christmas, could be waiting a couple more weeks longer to get that bill passed.
It seems to me it's a sign of this of this dysfunctional Congress that the House is totally gone this week, and the Senate is here, and it's already Thursday, and it doesn't look like they're going to even leave today. And they're continuing to work and to get things done, and nothing in the House. I mean, so how can one House of Congress be working so hard at stuff, and the other House just simply not even missing in action?
The House is pretty rigid about their schedule, and we saw them change it during the shutdown, but it's very unusual for them to change what is said in the beginning of the year. They took only 1 week for Thanksgiving, where the Senate took 2. So at the end of the day, they both will have only worked 2 weeks in December. But that only having 1 week of overlap is causing them some problems because they can't keep talking about these things. They lost a week on the front end of negotiations. They've lost a week on the back end. And they're not going to be able to get this UI done. And there wasn't really a sense of urgency. I think that we saw Democrats getting unhappy at the end that it wasn't there, but no one was talking about it until that last week, which was surprising that we weren't hearing more, even from Democrats, about how this was going to run out at the end of the month.
What is the unfinished business that the Senate will be taking up today?
They have the Defense Authorization Act, which is a very pared down bill that's not going to be subject to amendments on the floor. So we're not going to see a vote on Iran sanctions.
This is funding for...
This is authorization. So this is the ability for the Department of Defense basically to function. It is an annual bill that has to get done, and it allows them to continue to do the things they do with congressional permission. It's a big piece of legislation.
Right. And there were two, at least that I know of, two important amendments that were talked about. One was an amendment, as you just indicated, to impose stronger, stiffer sanctions against Iran. No vote?
No vote. And
not even going to be debated and voted on.
Not going to be debated and voted on. Had they come to some type of agreement on this NDAA bill sooner, we might have seen Iran negotiated in there. But we know the White House didn't really want it because of their talks with Iran. And the second big thing is sexual assault. Senator Gillibrand had been pushing very hard to include a new oversight program for this, some new rules about how sexual assault complaints are heard in the Department of Defense. And because they couldn't get it done, they couldn't come to an agreement, she got left out as well. And will be no vote on that either.
Well, but she and Claire McCaskill both get left out, right? I mean,
right.
So what does that mean? It's just the status quo remains then for the issue of sexual assault in the military? Which even the military acknowledges is what one of the generals called a cancer? eating at the Pentagon?
So the Pentagon says they're working to address it internally. Members of Congress like Gillibrand, like McCaskill have said this is not enough. We need to change it. There's some changes to how reporting is done. So do you report to your direct senior, or does it go somewhere else? Which in the military, who you complain to in the chain of command is a big deal. They want to change that. The Pentagon doesn't. And so it's going to be left out. It's not going to be included. They're hopeful they can bring a separate piece of legislation next year. But we've seen how well Congress moves pieces of the legislation, and they don't do it very well.
Right.
So without attaching it, it's a big deal in Congress, attaching something that's not incredibly popular in the halls of Congress to something that has to get done. It's about the only way to do it. And without something attached to it, could be a whole other year before some of those changes are made.
The Republicans are not happy with the fact that Harry Reid changed the filibuster rules. At the same time, because he changed the filibuster rules, there have been several nominations that have been held up for a long time that have gotten through. We now have a transportation secretary, right? We now have a secretary of Homeland Security, neither of whom were real controversial. They just were being held up for the sake of being held up. We now have, 3 D.C. district court judges that have been confirmed. One that is still, and there may be some others I'm forgetting, but I was reminded yesterday that we do not yet have a new head of the Fed, right? Janet Yellen, everybody thinks will be. Ben Bernanke talked about her yesterday as the new head of the Fed. Yesterday was his last news conference as chairman. Are they going to do that before they leave?
There's little doubt that she's got the support, especially with the new rules to pass. But what we've seen is Republicans unhappy about Reid changing those rules on the filibuster, dragging everything else out. So if you want to do that, watch us hold up and slow down the process. I mean, the budget, overwhelming bipartisan support. They couldn't vote on it till Wednesday because Republicans delayed the process. And that is causing a different type of logjam in the Senate. I would expect them to address Yellen before they go home at the end of the week. And Reid has...
Which is today or tomorrow, right?
Reid has threatened to bring them back or keep them on the weekend if they can't start moving things more quickly. But it is something that we're seeing a little bit of an attempt at a backlash for Reid. Maybe short-lived. Maybe they'll go home for Christmas and have some Christmas cheer and come back and decide they don't want to keep holding things up as much as they can. But the time is getting short.
Are there any other major nominations that are still held up?
At this point, they've moved the big ones. So they've moved, as you said, DHS,
Yellen,
except for Yellen. Those 3 district court judges were really what might have been the cause of the change in the rules.
Right.
It appeared Republicans were going to block judges, hoping to get through the next presidential election if they could.
And just to remind us all that the changes in the filibuster that the leader Reid brought about only affect executive nominations, correct?
Correct. So it's everything except nominations, except Supreme Court, but it doesn't affect bills. So the same rules of filibuster still apply for bills, and we saw with the budget, had to clear that 60 vote margin to be able to get it onto the floor and hold a vote. So it's just nominations. They can't speed anything else up.
And Republicans oppose it, even for nominations.
Even for nominations, and
so they want Democrats. If there's next time there's a Republican, if and when there's a Republican president, they want Democrats to be able to block any appointments of that Republican president? I doubt it.
I don't think so. But, when we look at the track record of who's done this and how often we've seen nominations, even to something like the district court or to lower nominations held up for other reasons, which is a lot of what was going on with the other nominations. They were holding them up to talk about Benghazi, to talk about something other than the nominee. It's not a tactic Democrats have used a lot. It's not something they've done as much. So the expectation that they had to worry about Democrats doing that whenever it was their turn, not as likely a problem for them.
No, I mean, I think the facts, not the politics, the facts speak for that Republicans brought this on themselves by their obstructionism. Now, the big question then, Ginger Gibson with us from Politico, is whether or not this coming together on the budget has changed the mood in Congress about working together and might offer some signs of hope on other issues. We'll get into that with Ginger Gibson when we come back. In studio with us, Ginger Gibson, congressional reporter for Politico. Again, thanks for coming in, Ginger. So I've read several stories that things look more promising now on the Hill because first time in a long time, a Democrat and Republican decided we're going to sit down and work together and get something done. And Patty Murray and Paul Ryan were able to do this. Not only that, they were able to take it back and sell it to their caucuses, which wasn't automatic at all. And they got a budget deal. Not only get a budget deal, which may not be it's not the grand bargain. It's not the big deal that maybe we need, but it is a deal. It's something Republicans and Democrats both voted for in the House and in the Senate. The leadership of both parties did, except for Mitch McConnell in the Senate, and we know why. But not only that, for what it does this year, but it means that for the next 2 years, we're not going to have these end of every month fiscal crisis, right? And those last minute negotiations and deals and everything. So, people of the stories I've read is now this shows that Congress can work again, people feel good about each other again, and we can get some things done on other issues. Right or wrong?
I am not a betting gal, but if I were a betting gal, I would not bet that this is going to usher in a new era of great bipartisan cooperation.
You're throwing cold water on all of this?
It could.
Happy talk?
Everyone kept saying it's a great first step. It's a first step. It's a first step. But the leap to go from agreeing how to get, what is really $50 billion difference between the two of them to a middle place, which in the grand scheme of things in a $1 trillion budget is not a whole lot. 50 billion seems like a lot, but it's not in this context. To passing immigration reform or a background check or just generally maybe liking each other a little bit more is a big leap. There's a lot of space between what the budget deal is and what it would take to get some of these other things done. Could it? Absolutely. Could they have stayed in fiscal stalemate and still come to an agreement on some of the other things? Absolutely. But they had a lot of currents working against them. So they're dealing with an election year. Mm-hmm. They're dealing with division in the Republican Party about what to do about immigration. And they haven't worked those things out. And until they work those out, we're not likely to see those other bills start to move through the Congress.
Well, but there's another factor here, which is John Boehner and his willingness to challenge the Tea Party. Now, for example, you mentioned immigration reform. Every guest that we've had in from the House, every House member has said the same thing, that if there were Republicans and Democrats, if there were a vote in the full House on the comprehensive immigration reform bill that passed the Senate, it would pass in the House. There are enough Democratic and Republican votes there if John Boehner would only allow a vote. He has not because he was afraid to stand up to the Tea Party on that and many other issues. On this budget deal, he did stand up to the Tea Party. He even attacked those outside groups that are really kind of fueling and funding the Tea Party, and he survived politically. He's still Speaker today, right? So if Boehner sees that he can do it in one case and survive politically, why wouldn't he in other cases?
This is with Boehner and the budget standing up to the Tea Party, a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation here. So did he stand up to the Tea Party and that allowed him to move forward and then everyone voted for it? Or was everyone going to vote for it so it was already going to move to the floor and that's why he stood up to the Tea Party?
Well, they weren't going to vote for it if he didn't call for a vote. If he didn't allow a vote.
Right. And we get the Hastert rules at play here, right? And the Hastert rules at play here with immigration. We don't, absolutely correct. As someone who watches the House very closely, I think that if it went to the floor, it would pass. Almost every single Democrat in the House would vote for it, if not every single Democrat in the House. Yeah. And there would be enough Republicans who would come along and vote for it as well. The question is, does it have it doesn't, we don't think, have a majority of the Republican caucus. And without a majority of the majority, that's where Boehner starts to have problems.
Well, that's what he's been hiding behind. But he has the only time this House, you know better than I. This is you cover it every day. The only time the House has been able to get anything done is when he's been willing to ignore the House, put it aside.
And that's, a lot of speculation about Boehner's future. Is he Speaker again in 2 years? Does he want to stick around? Does he get to the end of the term and start to go, I'm a lame duck, even though I haven't said it, and I'll put the bill on the floor? Speculation that once they get out of primary season, it then becomes politically advantageous for them to start voting on stuff like this. But it is all up to Boehner. He has said repeatedly he won't put the Senate bill on the floor, and his people are opposed to putting pieces on the floor for fear of a conference.
Well, I'm a hopeless optimist, so I'm going to, I'm not naive, but I hope at least I think there's more of a potential for some progress than you. I hope I'm right and you're wrong, but I'm not convinced that I'm right. Okay. Sister Gibson, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays.
Merry Christmas. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming in today.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. John Schmitt, Jonathan Zimmerman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to